Okay, so the last thing that I remember us learning is that you're allowed to draw up. This was a very long sif that we had started. Why don't we start it again? V'chein bishtar mechira. We had learned about promissory notes. We had learned that it's okay if witnesses are aware of a debt that has been generated, then as long as the debtor instructs them to write it up, the creditor does not have to be present, but not vice versa. If the creditor asks them to write it up in the absence of the debtor, they have to get express permission from the debtor before writing up the promissory note. Okay, but then he says, V'chein b'shtar mechira, ein kosvin, v'chosmin l'lokeach, sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened, but hopefully that's only a one-off. If it becomes a problem, I'll use the cable, okay? Let me just share my screen again. Okay, and I do believe we are recording. Okay, so he says, "Va'afilu omer halokeach kisvuhu v'chismuhu." Even if the seller, even if the buyer says to the witnesses, guys, just write up a bill of sale, v'yihiye biyedchem ad sheyavo hamocher v'yetzav litnoli, and you keep it in escrow until the seller instructs you to give me the bill of sale. You still can't write, the witnesses still cannot write it up. V'chein bishtar matana, and the same thing is true with a bill of not of sale, of gift. A gift document, if the recipient says, write up the draft that says that he's giving me a gift, and just hold on to it until he finalizes it. He said the witnesses do not have a right to do that, even if they've heard from the gifter that he wishes to give the gift. Okay, let's just hold it there and take a look at the Imrei Yaakov. Okay, ein kosvin v'chosmin lalokeach, that the witnesses cannot draw up a bill of sale to the buyer in the absence of the seller. Yesh omrim, da'af im ba halokech va'omer la'edim, kisvu, ech she'amarti lifneim she'kanisi sada ploni mi ploni, degam lazeh ein shomin lo. He says that if the buyer says to them, guys, do me a favor, write up a bill of sale that I have purchased a field from so-and-so and he has sold it to me. He says, you don't listen to him. He says, because in other words, even if they document in the bill of sale that this is only based on what the buyer has told us, the buyer instructed us to write up a bill of sale, and we are hereby writing up the bill of sale based on what he told us. So they're trying to, sort of exonerate themselves by saying, we were not witness to the sale. We just know that the buyer told us that he bought the property, and it's on that basis that we drafted this document. Now, obviously, you can't use that document and take it to court and take the guy's property based on that. Mikol makom yihye ktsas kol bazeh sheploni machar sadehu, the yigrom di yazilu nichsei o shum tam acher. But this creates a disadvantage for the owner of the field, because once you draw a paper that even suggests that the owner of the field is contemplating selling his property, you're now creating a public perception that is going to depreciate his property. In other words, I'm sure there's comparable situations in, like for example, if I start legal action against a person, and it's even if it's a frivolous lawsuit, I could end up causing him damage by depreciating or diminishing his ability to sell his home.
And there's reputational risk as well, right?
There's reputational risk, but there's also just specifically on the property in question, especially like if you draft a document that has no teeth in it, but it says that Plony is selling his property to me, then other people who are going to be interested in the property are going to say, wait a minute, why should we buy anything from you? We hear you're selling your whole estate. So we don't want to get locked up into some kind of litigation or things like that, right? And that's a problem. I've had a couple of times people have told me, so I'm getting sued, and because I'm getting sued, I can't sell my house because it's locked up in the lawsuit, right? And so it's a similar kind of situation over here where the halacha does not allow witnesses to draw up hearsay, because even hearsay, even though it may not have the legal standing to extract the property, but it will still create a reputational issue for the owner of the property. Okay, next. Afilu kvar kanu v'chulei shelo bifnei halokeach. Even if they were witness to a kinyan that was made with the seller in the absence of the buyer, where the seller said, I'm selling this property to Plony and I make a kinyan with the Edom. So he says, and the reason why the witnesses cannot draw a paper for that is delo amrinan stam kinyan leksiva omeid ela im haya befanav. He says, because we don't say that it's assumed that you want documentation drawn up unless both parties are present. When only one party is present, when only the debtor is present and he commits himself to either sell or to pay back money to somebody, then we don't assume that he wants a record of it in writing unless both parties are present. As we mentioned previously, we did see this before, that there's a big machlokas here. There are some poskim who say that as long as witnesses clearly see that this guy has made a kinyan, either that he's indebting himself, or anytime a person indebts himself in front of witnesses and makes a kinyan over that debt, whether it's to pay back money or whether it's to sell a property, then the witnesses are allowed to draw up documentation, even in the absence of the other party. So this is a big machlokas. And the truth is that if the witnesses wish to say that we want to side with one opinion over the other, they do have a right to do so. Okay. Vafilu Amar halokeach, and
Oops, I guess the rabbi's going to have to go to the cable.
that
Rabbi, if you can hear us, you are freezing. Here
Sorry,
comes the cable.
I just went to get the cable to hopefully prevent this from happening.
Thank you.
That changes things for the better. We shall see. Got to give it a minute though. Okay, let me share my screen again. And the question is, are we still recording? That's the only thing that.
It says live YouTube in the corner, so I don't know what that means.
Yeah. So we still are recording. Okay. So if we go back to where he says the previous in Sifkat and Kuf Aleph, the Tumim had argued with the Rav Shulchan Aruch and had said that when they witness a kinyan and the creditor says you hold it in escrow, then they are allowed to write it. So that's what he means. He says Ayin la'el sif yotes divrei masol va'afilu b'shem hatumim. That too is a machlokes. When they know for sure that the guy has indebted himself, and when the buyer says hold it in escrow until the seller tells you to give me the bill of sale, the Rav Shulchan Aruch says they should not draw it up. But the Tumim, Rabbi Yonas and Eibshit says they could draw it up. So here you have a machlokes. V'yihiyeh b'yedchem, and you hold on to it and keep it in escrow. V'chayshinan shema yipol miyadam hashtarchov o yigan venu kid la'el sif yutes. Again, we're worried again about the concern that maybe it will get stolen or it'll get lost, and then the purchaser will find it and he'll be able to use it improperly. That's why we don't write it up for the buyer, even if he says hold it in escrow. Okay, so v'chein bishtar matana, and the same thing is true with a bill of gifting. Okay, shahamakabel ba lifnei ha'edim, that the recipient of the gift comes before witnesses and says to them, do me a favor, so-and-so is giving me a gift. Just draw a paper that says that on such and such a date, he gifted it to me, and hold it in escrow. We don't listen to him. Again, if they witness the kinyan of the gift, this is where Rabbi Yonas and Eibshit would disagree. Okay, let's continue in the language of the Rav Shulchan Aruch. Aval kosvin lemocher, afal pi she'ein halokeach imo. What we are allowed to do is just like we said by debts. If a debtor says, draw up a promissory note in the absence of the creditor, we may do so. Similarly, if a seller says, draw up a bill of sale and the buyer is absent, then that we may do. But v'hu shekanu miyado b'kinyan sutter. That's provided that the seller did a kinyan with the witnesses. She'ein bo mishum mukdam. He says, and thereby you're ensuring that you're not predating the sale, okay, in any way. They have to be witness to a kinyan where a transfer of ownership takes place, so they know exactly when the transfer took place. And the reason why that's necessary is because if all the seller says to them is to draw up a bill of sale, then that could be in order to swindle a third party. Because he says, look, draw up a bill of sale that I sold my house to Plony, when in reality it didn't happen. And this way he'll be able to swindle another group of guys. So when he sells the third party his house, then he'll be able to say, oh, you don't realize I really sold it to somebody else before you, and therefore you got to give me the house back, and I'll get you the money eventually, that you that you put down. So you want to prevent any of that kind of swindling to take place. So let's take a look at the Rav Shulchan Aruch, at the Imrei Yaakov, Shekanu miyado b'kinyan suder, afal pi, she'ein hakona b'fanenu dizochen la'adam shelo b'fanav. He says, here, remember, the buyer does not have to be present when a seller makes a kinyan to transfer ownership to a buyer. And the reason is because of the principle of Zachin la'adam shelo b'fanav. We grant merit to a person in his absence. So, for example, if I go over to two witnesses and I say, make a kinyan, Reuven goes over to two witnesses and says, make a kinyan on behalf of Shimon that you are hereby acquiring my house on behalf of Shimon. So they make the kinyan, or they give Reuven the handkerchief. Reuven then transfers the house over to Shimon's name. They're allowed to record that kinyan that took place even in Shimon's absence. And the reason is because it's considered to be a zuchus, a privilege, or it's not privilege, it's considered to be
a benefit.
Right? Benefit. That's the word I'm looking for.
Yeah.
It's considered a benefit for Shimon to acquire a piece of real estate. Now, obviously, the only time this will work is if it's an unambiguous benefit. But let's say there could be some downside, a liability to his acquisition of real estate or some other kind of property. So then this would not work. Then you can't just draw up a bill of sale and make a kinyan on Shimon's behalf. What would be an example of where acquiring something could be a liability for him? It could be maintenance of a property where clearly, what? If there's money owed on it, if there's other kinds of, or let's say there's a tax liability, all of these things should be taken into consideration in a modern situation. B'keven she'en kosvenes hashtar b'loshon ki'ilu hiskim halokeach b'kinyan, ela shahamocher amar v'kach v'kach nimtza she'en bo tzad chov elalokeach. He says, since the witnesses are not writing the shtar to say that the buyer has agreed to purchase, but rather that the seller has given or sold the item straight out to the buyer, or has transferred ownership to the buyer, it turns out that there's no liability to the buyer. Obviously, if let's say the document says that the buyer has agreed to pay such and such a price, they can't write it unless they know that for a fact, right? So the document would have to be drafted in such a way that it's an attestation to the transfer of ownership, but it doesn't lay out the terms of what the sale was based on. Okay. Now, and you have to make sure she'ein bo mishum muktam, when the witnesses see the kinyan, there's no longer a problem of a predated shtar. De'im lo kanu minei b'kinyan suder ikalachush mishum muktam. He says if they're not witness to a kinyan, you do have to worry that maybe this will be a predated shtar. The shema kosav litno lo b'nisan v'lo nasno ad tishrei. You have to be concerned that maybe the shtar records that the transfer is taking place in Nisan, but the actual delivery of the property is not going to take place until Tishrei. And then it turns out that the shtar is predated by a full 6 months. Uveni leveni ozalo mocher la'acher, like I illustrated for you. And in the interim, the owner of the property can go and sell it to a third party. V'yavo zeh v'yotzi shtaro shezmanu b'nisan v'yitrof me'halokeach es asada shelo kedin. And then the guy who has the predated shtar from Nisan will come along and say, hey, you guys had no right to buy the property. It was already mine. Look at my shtar, sharei be'emes lo zachabo. And in reality, it wasn't his. The avsha shtar nichtav b'nisan Mikol makom hol v'lo haya kinyan sudar, v'lo nimser lo ashtar ela b'tishrei. He says, but since the shtar reflects Nisan, but there was no kinyan, and there was no transfer of a shtar until Tishrei, harei rak az zacha b'kinyan asada. Then only the guy who's making the claim, who's holding the bill of sale, only really acquired it 6 months later. Ulam kol zehu rak ledas haposkim delo svir lehu edav b'chasuma of zachin lo. Aval yesh omrim desvir le the edav b'chasuma of zachin lo. He says, remember, we saw this machlokes also before, that there is an opinion that says that as soon as the witnesses sign a document, that is in itself the method of kinyan. Okay? In other words, you don't have to make any additional kinyan. L'daitam gam below kinyan kosvin l'mocher. Then according to that opinion, they could write up the shtar as long as they sign their names. Once they sign their names, that in itself represents a kinyan, a transfer of ownership from Ruvain to Shimon. Okay. Now, Afal Pisha, okay. The Chain Bishtar Matana, and the same thing is true with a gift that the witnesses have to witness the actual kinyan in order for them to write up a shtar that a transfer has been made. V'im achar hakinyan, amar hamocher stam, kisvu shtar mechira, v'lo amar sheyitnuhu liyado, harei elu kosvin v'chosmin v'nostin lahalokeach. Then the next thing we saw is that if after the witnesses witness a transaction, that let's say in the absence of the buyer, a guy says, I'm hereby selling my property to Shimon, and he makes a kinyan with the witnesses, and then he instructs the witnesses, please go ahead and draw up paper that reflects the bill of sale. If he did not say explicitly to give it to the buyer, they may assume that not only do they have permission to draft the paper, but they also have permission to give it to the buyer. Lefi shemin hastam, because we may assume that daito sheyitnu lahalokeach velo liyado ad sheyafaresh, because we assume that the purpose of the bill of sale is to be held by the buyer, unless the seller says explicitly, draw a paper and give it to me, and I'll give it to the buyer. But if he doesn't say anything like that, he just says, draw up the bill of sale, then they can draw it up and just give it outright to the buyer. V'chein b'shtar chov sheyesh bo kinyan. And the same thing is true with a promissory note. If a debtor, they see a debtor making a kinyan to indebt himself to pay a certain amount of money to a creditor, and the debtor instructs them, draw up the promissory note, and that's all he says, they can assume that he wants the promissory note to be delivered to the creditor. He doesn't have to say it explicitly. The only time they wouldn't be allowed to give it to the creditor is if he says to them explicitly, let me hold on to that note until I can give it to the creditor. Okay, and so let's take a look at the Imrei Yaakov. Amar hamocher, if the seller says, draw up the bill of sale, the afsha hakinyan haya shelo bifnei hakona. He says, even though we've been talking about a transaction that is not done in the presence of the buyer, but we call it a benefit to the buyer, so it can be done in his absence. He says, and therefore, if without a kinyan, they would not be able to just draw a paper, but since he said afterwards, draw up paper, and to reflect that he wants there to be a record of it, below hisna she yitnu lo hashtar, and he didn't say explicitly, give me the bill of sale. Lachein rishoim heim litno liad hakoina mishum demistama daitu he kain she yitnu lakona. They are therefore permitted to give it outright to the buyer because we assume that that's what he wants. We assume that once he said draw up a bill of sale, that he wants it to go into the hands of the buyer. V'chein b'shtar chov, sheyesh bo kinyan, and the same thing is true with generating a debt. Dahol va'asa halov kinyan, that since the borrower, the debtor, has made a kinyan with the witnesses, indebting himself to the creditor, even though if it wasn't done in the presence of the creditor, and therefore they're not allowed to draw up a promissory note unless the guy gives them permission. But once he tells them to draw up the promissory note, but they can therefore write it up and give it to the creditor. They don't have to consult with the debtor before giving it to the malva. Once the lova, or once the person who's the debtor party, tells them to go ahead and draw up paper to make a record of this, they don't have to ask express permission to deliver it to the creditor. Okay, here's an interesting discussion in the Biurim. He says, Matsuya davar. He says, a common practice. Sha'adam holech el mitavech. Person goes to a broker. V'hamitavech machtim oto al shtar muchanu minusach. And the broker has him sign a standard agreement. She'im hu yikna o yiska bayis sha'hamitavech itzialo, that the person who signs the document hereby agrees that if the broker is able to find him a house or an apartment that he ends up buying or renting, then the person signing the paper agrees to pay the broker a certain amount of money or a certain percentage, a commission, right? And the broker presents him with the document, and the person, the buyer, signs the document. He says, let's consider, with his signature, is he really obligating himself to pay that which is contained in the document? Now, that's an interesting question.
Why not? Why not?
Why not? So on the one, first of all, the person signing it has, I guess, maybe the broker hasn't even picked up the paper yet at all. That's what he seems to be saying. What he's saying is that the person signing the document hasn't even picked up the document, hasn't made the document his. It was just put in front of him, and he was told to sign. Since he didn't yet acquire the document, I'm not sure why this should be an issue. But he says perhaps a signature alone would not be enough. We'll have to look at this tomorrow and see what his shaila is. So we'll hold it here for today.
That's quite a cliffhanger, Rabbi.
Okay, we'll hold it here for today, and we'll continue.
Shkoyach.